A very warm welcome, everyone, to the Maritime Education Podcast. My name is Barry Sadler, and for those regulars, welcome back. And for those of you just joining the podcast, it's great to have you on board. So this podcast follows up on my IMO Net Zero podcast that I put out on the 12th of October this year, prior to the extraordinary meeting of the Maritime Environmental Protection Committee at the IMO. Now, this extraordinary meeting was convened in order to bring about a vote for adoption of the IMO's net zero framework, which, if you listen to the podcast from October the 12th, I go into some detail as to what that entailed. The committee started meeting on the 14th of October, just 2 days after my podcast, and began debating climate change and debating whether the IMO's net zero framework was going to be adopted by the IMO, subsequently ratified, and with tacit acceptance made an international standard in due course. Now, some of you may have read what happened during those few days at the IMO. Tuesday the 14th, the committee met, but unfortunately by Friday the 17th, a vote had been tabled which adjourned the committee meeting for 1 year, so no decision was made on the adoption of that IMO net zero framework. This generally happened because developed countries, and in particular those developed countries with perhaps an interest in oil and oil-related products and services, were very, very much against any kind of investment or move forward to try and either fund or encourage countries to invest in new means of propulsion, new marine fuels, and the move away from the fossil fuels that are, at the end of the day, putting so much greenhouse gas into the Earth's atmosphere. Generally led by the US and including countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, a vote was tabled to adjourn that meeting, and this vote narrowly passed. It passed 49 votes against to 57 votes for an adjournment, so just 8 votes in it. And political pressure from the largest countries within that group that opposed the IMO net zero framework put pressure on smaller countries to support the adjournment. This is obviously a disappointing outcome for the IMO, who were looking to be one of the first international organisations to adopt a framework that required credits to be purchased by ship owners whose ships were polluting the most. It was actually a key agreement that needed to be reached, a landmark deal to cut global shipping emissions. And, of course, as I've just described, this deal unfortunately fell on the 17th of October. 3 days later, I was invited to London to interview somebody that was on that very committee and talk to them about the events that had happened the previous week and to why the IMO's net zero framework was so important. John Taukave is a technical researcher and cultural support for pretty much the Micronesian set of islands that were represented at these IMO talks. He works for the Micronesian Centre for Sustainable Transport, and in conjunction with representatives from other Polynesian islands, Micronesian islands, such as the Marshall Islands, he was there not just to give technical support to the committee, but cultural support in bringing forward how important steps like this were to the people of those South Pacific islands. Indeed, John's home island only lies 4.5 metres above sea level. And his home island actually has an agreement with Australia that if, because of climate change, the sea levels rise and his home island is threatened, then they can be resettled in Australia. That's how serious climate change is affecting these South Pacific islands. As you'll hear from my interview with John, John speaks remarkably passionately about this framework, about climate change, and about all that him and all of those really from that part of the world are doing to try and reduce greenhouse gases, reduce global warming, and at the end of the day preserve the culture, heritage, and literally the islands that these guys live on. Anyway, enough from me. Let's have a little listen to the interview, and it's great to have you on board once again. Please do enjoy listening to John Taukave. Just one small point before I start the interview. John does start to speak in his home language as a welcome to me. Don't worry, the interview wasn't conducted in his home language. He's literally welcoming me to the conversation and then breaks into English a little bit further on. Enjoy the interview, guys. I've got a really special guest with me today. I'm up in London, right next door to the IMO at the rather nice Hyatt Regency Hotel, and I'm sat here with John Taukave. John, a very good afternoon to you.
Barry.
Barry.
Ma tin e ngangats tu takoa o snoa e Maori. Lalang navte le te nafta leone o ki se fangangats te Barry ma o podcast. Nafta leone o ki reko mus ngarue ma mus hanisi se os liutarava. I just wanted to first introduce myself in Rutuman and acknowledge your presence, Brother Barry, and the work that you're doing on this podcast. And I think it's really good to tell the stories and just acknowledge your love for the oceans as well.
Thank you very much, John. John, tell me all about yourself.
First of all, starting with the IMO, I'm currently I'm a researcher. I'm a technical researcher and cultural support advisor for the Micronesian Center for Sustainable Transport. It's a regional organization based out of the Marshall Islands that provides technical and cultural support for Pacific delegations, specifically on the Six-Pack Coalition. The Six-Pack is the Pacific Coalition that comes to the GHG negotiations here. And I'm also a doctoral PhD researcher at the University of Amsterdam.
Excellent, excellent. And John, we're at the IMO primarily for the net zero framework, MEPC. But before we go into that, tell me a bit about the IMO from your perspective, John. I mean, I teach about the IMO every day and about the regulations that come out of the IMO. Yeah. But let's talk about the IMO as a body itself. Tell me a bit about the IMO.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. First, before coming into the IMO, I come from an island in the Pacific called Rotuma. It's in Fiji. And so I was raised around the ocean, and the ocean is basically a part of our lives. So, growing up in Fiji, in Vatuanga, we were right next to the ocean in Vatuanga. Shout out to all the Vatuanga and the Rotuma communities out there, if you're listening to this. So basically the ocean was part of us growing up. And the ocean really gave us a sense of identity. And so going throughout my research work, the ocean became more than just a body of water for me. It became a whole identity that I started to adopt. And when I first stepped into the IMO in 2022, I immediately felt that the IMO was a space not built for voices like mine.
Not built for voices like
Not mine. Built for voices like mine, because when I first stepped in 2022, I think this was during ISWG 17, or was it MEPC 79, one of those in 2022. When I first stepped in, I automatically felt a presence, an aura that the experiences of Pacific peoples and just listening to the stories about Pacific people's voices in that space were always, in a way, left behind or sidelined. And it was very discouraging, but it was also an opportunity for me to realize that coming into the space and bringing the ocean and the ancestors of the ocean, from the Pacific that voyaged for millennia, bringing that same spirituality, but also that same mantra to come into that space and to really try and reframe our presence and our voices in at the IMO. So that was my first introduction to the IMO, that I knew that it was always going to put our voices behind, leave us behind. And I noticed that in many of the negotiations that the Pacific was not involved in those critical discussions. There was always a certain, power elite that would always negotiate text. Mm-hmm. And it was very hard to see those in the beginning. But then constantly learning about, despite all of these setbacks that the Pacific faces at the IMO, they always continue to show up with the support of our leaders. And despite, being sidelined, they always show up to make sure that their voices are heard. And you see that really well in their interventions as well. So
in the UK, we have something called the Red Ensign Group, in which the United Kingdom are the representatives at the IMO, and we bring in British overseas territories under the same Red Ensign flag. Okay. The UK represents them at the IMO, but they follow the United Kingdom legislation in general. Is it the same for Pacific Islands? Do you have representation at the IMO individually, or do you go under a collective?
For me, I think it's both, because the member states, they come together, but we also have a regional body, and that's the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership. And we also have the Pacific Islands Forum. But specifically on decarbonization of maritime shipping, we have this the Pacific Blue Shipping Partnership, which is a collective of countries that are trying to decarbonize their fleet within the Pacific region. Right. And it's this group of countries that really have moved forward to make sure that happens. That what we agree internationally also applies to the region as well.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So at the IMO, as we both know, they have various committees at the IMO. A lot of my teaching surrounds the Maritime Safety Committee. Oh, okay. And we have MSCs that come out of the Maritime Safety Committee. Yeah. Very, very different beast to the committee that you have been sitting on whilst in London over the past week.
Yes.
The MEPC, the Maritime Environmental Protection Committee.
Yep.
MEPC meeting number 80.
Yep.
80
was in
April.
April,
yeah. And this was an extraordinary meeting that took place last week.
MEPC 83.
83, sorry.
83 was in April.
I should know that. Yeah. 83. So, were you here in April, John?
I was here in April.
Tell me about that MEPC meeting in April. Tell me, how did it feel to be in the room? Give me an idea of how it feels to be inside the IMO.
So what we agreed in April was to the net zero framework, right? But initially, the Pacific, we abstained because what the net zero framework did not support us. It did not support a 1.5 trajectory pathway. It wasn't the best option for our countries. And we abstained from that vote because what we brought was a mandatory universal levy on all GHG emissions. Okay. So it was a simple, flat, universal levy on all ships for their carbon emissions. And I think over 60 countries, all agreed to this levy. And we made a submission on it, and it was, in a way, it was put aside. And that was a big disappointment on that part, because, over 60 countries that sponsored this paper on this levy their voices were not heard, And so what happened in 83 was we adopted this net zero framework in which the Pacific abstained, obviously, because it wasn't the best option. However, the net zero framework was not the best option on the table, but it was an option.
Right.
And for us, we reflected on that decision ever since 83. And coming into this session, this extraordinary session, which was a really extraordinary session last week.
Yes.
We thought, okay, we might as well have a framework that we can continue to work on and improve, and, make sure that what we get from this framework, like, for example, the revenues from this framework contributes to a just and equitable transition, making sure that, states like SIDS and LDCs, like in the Pacific, are not left behind, that they're part of that transition. And so we decided that, okay, we're going to support this net zero framework in good faith that we can continue to work on it later. Because if we did not, it would take us way back behind. And obviously that happened last week, where this whole thing was delayed.
Did you have assurances from the IMO that the monies and the credits that would be paid in against the IMO net zero framework, they said we're going to help countries develop their own GHG strategies. Were you confident that the IMO would have taken your home islands into account when distributing those funds for that purpose?
Yeah. So that was where a just and equitable transition came in. And that's what we always fought for, to make sure that the revenues, from this, economic mechanism was justly and equitably distributed, meaning that, revenues from this would come towards the developing states, especially SIDS and LDCs, so that they could transition.
Right.
Yeah. And that was what we're always fought for, because, the developed world, if they'll obviously transition. And the transition is going to cost.
Yes.
And it's going to cost money. And so for us, for the developing states, it's going to be really costly for us, because one, like in the Pacific, where our geographical locations from these international markets, we pay 2 or 3 times more shipping, and shipping is our lifeline.
Yes.
And so we need to make sure that, if we're going to transition, that we're, that we are able to afford the transition. And that was what the JET was, to make sure that revenues were distributed, not only for the transition, but for states to transition as well.
I think the everyday Joe in the street sometimes thinks that transition to greenhouse gas principles and the reduction of greenhouse gas is almost a free event. Transitioning, finding extra fuels, finding solutions to greenhouse gases, they just kind of happen.
Yeah.
And it's not the case, is it? Countries, especially island nations, in the Pacific, you need funding, don't you, to be able to do the research in order to do this?
We need to maintain the ports. We need to, we need the, seafarer training to, and we need to make sure that, we are able to transition as well. So,
from what I gather, in April, although you didn't support directly the net zero framework proposed by the IMO, it was the best that was on offer.
We abstained, You
abstained. And then we move on to last week.
Yeah.
So you were in the actual meeting, I believe, last week on Friday.
On the ground.
It started, didn't it, on Thursday? When did the actual extraordinary session start? Was it Thursday, Friday?
It started on Tuesday.
Oh, Tuesday.
Yeah, It started on Tuesday and ended on Friday.
Right.
The actual vote came on Friday.
So at what point during that process did you realise that things may not be going in the direction that I believe most people expected it to go?
We already knew from Tuesday when MEPC first started, when the extraordinary session first started, there was going to be a lot of pressure, from the big states.
Yeah.
And I think we even felt that from our own. We even felt that from our own countries. We felt that pressure coming in from the States. We were set note verbals, and one thing that I'm always going to be appreciative is, despite the pressures from the developed states, you know who I mean.
Yeah.
Despite that pressure, our leaders decided to stand firm on our positions, and that was something encouraging, very encouraging.
Good.
It was unfortunate for others, and we saw the pressure, because at the end of the day, it literally came to a political decision, and it reached the highest levels of our governments. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that was evident, was it, from the Tuesday onwards?
From the Tuesday, and then I think by Thursday evening towards Friday, it was going to be a tough call because we still didn't know how it would go. It was going to be a really close call. And then Friday morning came not Friday morning, like Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
It was already, the vote came. But from Tuesday to Thursday night, it was my first time also to see how the delayed tactics of these, the developed states would go on. It was extraordinary to see. But it was, yeah.
They were just kicking the can down the road until they managed to get more states to succumb to their wishes.
And it was like just simple things like asking for more time, interventions, repeated interventions, and in a way, it was like for me in my first session to see that. It was crazy. Like the theatrics was incredible. Like
theatrics. I think that's a key word from what I understand.
Yeah.
Theatrics is a key word, and the IMO itself. We spoke just now about there being different committees. When you're in a safety committee, things to be a little bit more mundane and a little bit more straightforward.
Yeah.
But once we get into an environmental committee, things start to get a little bit theatrical because the players have the moves that they wish to make.
Yep.
So I did a podcast last week on what net zero was. So we're not going to go into what net zero actually is, other than just to remind the listeners that a key part of it was that ship owners would be buying credits against ships that were emitting more greenhouse gas than they would reasonably expect it to. So we won't talk about that, but let's talk about now where we're at. So what happened on Friday? So I came through on my phone. I was obviously watching, waiting. I even texted young Barbara to see if she could enlighten me. So I was waiting. So tell me about what finally happened on Friday at this extraordinary committee meeting.
So on Friday there were the net zero framework that we've literally been trying to fight for the whole week was actually decided that it was going to be postponed by a year. And it was really, really disappointing that it had to come down. It was a close vote. I think it was
49-57.
49-57 votes. It was a close one. But it was very disheartening that it reached that vote. And I think just seeing the disappointment, especially in the Pacific, that even though we disagreed to it, we agreed to that we'd continue to work on this. And then when it got postponed, it just showed us that it's going to be, these negotiations are going to be postponed for a year. And what does that 1 year mean? So 1 year of postponed negotiations means more sea level rise, more natural disasters hitting our region, more climate impacts, to our communities back home. And I think right after that, I got emotional about it because it was really bad. And so I came back to my hotel room, and the first thing I did was I called my family.
Yeah.
Because I felt like I failed them, and, you just bring, that those memories would stay with me forever. And to think that, we've invested more than 10 years of negotiations into this, and to get another year of postponement was disheartening. And a lot of our Pacific delegations were very disappointed at the outcome. And despite that, we were not going to tell ourselves, okay, we're defeated, we're not coming back or anything. And you see that right from yesterday at the intersessional working group now, that even though what we're discussing at the intersessional group, it's not binding, we're still showing up to do the work. We're working on the guidelines, the Net Zero Fund. We're all working at, the same tactics from the developed states saying that, it's premature to discuss. But no, we continue to show up. We're not going to let this defeat, cripple us or, make us give up. No, we're going to continue to work.
Significantly, it's an adjournment of that session.
Yeah.
So essentially, the session is still live.
Yeah, it's still alive.
Still there. It's still on the table.
We're still alive.
I think it was Saudi Arabia that tabled it in the end.
Yeah.
And the vote, as we've just said, was 57 for, 49 against, a year's adjournment of the committee. So net zero, still there on the table. A year down the line, you're quite right. There's a lot going to happen in that year.
But, the adjournment that, we still can adopt it, but it also has that opportunity to be killed or further adjourned. So we're mindful of that, but we're not thinking about that. Right. We're going to continue to work on it.
So in a year's time, you'll be back, John. You'll be back there fighting again at the IMO to try and get this across the line again.
You can count on that.
Do you think it'll look different in a year's time? I know this is real speculation now. Or do you think you're going to be able to bring this net zero framework back to the IMO in its current form?
Well, for me, just seeing all what happened on Friday, I think given some time of reflections and, going back home and then re-coordinating with our countries, I think it's going to be a good reflection on what to do. And I think one of the main things to do is to connect with the countries that supported to adopt the framework. Solidify our positions. Really get everyone's positions together to actually support it, and then from there we can outreach, because we know that many countries felt that pressure. But we also need to make sure that we really do that outreach and advocacy to those member countries to remind them of how important and how transformational this net zero framework is and how it can be towards the decarbonization transition. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. But apart from the outreach, there still needs to be work, done in the intersessional working groups, on the guidelines, on the net zero fund, for example, the fuel certification.
So what's an intersessional working group? I think the listeners will be really interested in knowing the technicalities of what happens in between.
Exactly. So the MEPC has a working group specifically on GHG emissions from ships. And it's within these intersessional groups that we work on text, that we negotiate on, the different technical aspects of what the net zero framework is. And then in these working groups, then we bring it to the MEPC for it to be adopted.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not just obviously the committee meetings are the important ones, because that's where adoption is created. That's where the regulatory framework is hammered home. Yeah. But these intersessional meetings sound equally as important, particularly when you're there representing, your home country and your home country's needs.
Yeah. And one thing, because apart from the technical, advice that we continue to provide to support our Pacific delegations, I think it's also a key element that when our Pacific delegations come into these spaces, that they not forget who they're representing. You're not just representing governments, you're representing communities, and to bring that, story and that spirit of the ocean from our ancestors coming, from the world's largest vast ocean, and bringing that mentality to come and say, we are descendants of these, of these amazing voyages. And so we want to take that mentality into these negotiations. Mm-hmm. And so what we've done is, it's been really successful, is in our outreach, while we're negotiating, we uphold cultural elements of negotiations. We apply our culture within our outreach strategies. So things like talanoa, ceremonial cover sharings, in building and nurturing relationships. And that's how I think we've really built a strong coalition that we currently have. And we're continuing to do it. So I think bringing our experiences from climate impact, but also our cultures, as descendants of great voyages, I think that's really helped. And just bringing that ocean and Vaka identity with us coming into these spaces. Because sometimes these spaces can be very demoralizing.
Right.
You know? And I think our viewers out there need to understand that when these spaces become demoralizing, we need to find community, because us from the Pacific, we're very strong on community, and we need to be together to support each other. And when we come to spaces like this, we make sure that we come together for briefs. We share, in Talana, what we call like this open dialogue. We have cover ceremonies just to practice those moments to encourage everyone that, you're not alone. We're all in this together. And it really helps in our coordination as well. We've built a really strong network.
Do you think this greenhouse gas strategy belongs at the IMO, or do you think it needs to move to its own plinth, really? Because, IMO was based around safety initially. The early days of IMO, load lines, SOLAS, safety on ships was the focus. Collision regulations. We could go through many of the early easily adopted conventions on safety. Yeah. But once we get to environmental, the IMO has always struggled a little bit. Do you think that we need to air this laundry outside of the IMO, or do you think the IMO can take it further?
I really have hope that the IMO can push this adoption on greenhouse gas emissions from ships, because shipping contributes to what almost 3% of all anthropogenic emissions, and I think shipping needs to pay for its emissions, because one, for us in the Pacific, we're always at the forefront. And, GHG emissions all emissions contribute to climate. And I think ships have a role in that. And I think the IMO, we almost had that chance last week, that the IMO would be the first forum to pass and adopt a carbon tax on greenhouse gas emissions. And if in 1 year's time, if we can achieve that, that will be a historic moment, not only for the Pacific, but for the IMO itself. Yeah. And they really, really, really need to, their reputation too is on the line. They have this opportunity for everyone.
It would have been the fuel the IMO needs to progress its strategy. This one win.
Yeah, and we feel that they failed us last week too. So we need to, again, remind everyone about what this means, not only for the region, for our regions, but for the IMO itself, in upholding its integrity, because it is committed to decarbonizing shipping, and from the GHG 2023 strategy, and we need to uphold what we've all agreed to in 2023 and make sure that we adopt that and continue on this trajectory to decarbonization by around 2050.
I know the Secretary General himself was very, very disappointed. I heard one account that he had his head in his hands for a lot of the meetings. I think you could see the writing on the wall, and it was a real shame. I think it's a really important point to make to our listeners is that the IMO needs a win on greenhouse gases.
Absolutely,
it needs to show that it can regulate shipping in a positive way.
Absolutely,
when it comes
because
to
we have the science to back it up. We have, the evidence that shipping does contribute. So we're supported by that. And we're also supported by the lived experiences of, small island developing states and LDCs, least developed countries. We have them. What else do we need? We need to ensure that this would be such a great opportunity historically. Yeah. So we still have that, and it's just on adjournment, but we still have that opportunity that we're not giving up on.
Do you think there's anything that could be, this is really looking into perhaps the intersection. Is there anything that could be tweaked, do you think, in the net zero framework that might make it more appealing to these developed countries that have this bee in their bonnet about... It's the bee in the bonnet at the end of the day is about the money, isn't it? I mean, let's face it, we're sat here and we've made the point already, greenhouse gas strategy is not a free strategy. Yeah. It is going to cost money to develop new fuels. It's going to cost money to develop this. What we're doing now costs money. Running the IMO costs money. Yeah. So it is all about money at the end of the day. It's all about the cost and the worry that these costs are somehow going to be passed unreasonably onto, You and I, we are the end users. You know, we're both sat here, we're both fully clothed, we have electrical devices. Yeah. We are the end users, you know. And I think you and I can sit here and honestly put our hands on our hearts and say we're not too concerned if our iPhone suddenly increases its cost by 50p in order to help this greenhouse gas. But the stumbling block to me from an outsider looks as if it is literally about money. But is there anything that could change in that net zero framework
I really think
might push it over the line?
No, I really think that the voices of the vulnerable need to be incorporated more. That there are the ones, especially the Pacific, you know, they're the ones in the front line. You know, it is about the money, you know, because we want to make sure that we're not left behind. But it's also about just making sure that our voices are heard in those spaces. And what I saw from our Pacific leaders last week was beyond amazing. You know, I'm really, really, really proud that we have leaders like that continue to fight and to make sure that, you know, we're heard. And also to our Pacific delegations here and the support, you know, the support that they've been getting, you know, really, really, really proud of them. And to be part of that experience where, you know, 10 years ago, it was really, really hard to see the Pacific even active in a space like that. To see it now as perhaps one of the most active, you know, and just making sure that we're part of those discussions and our voices are heard. I think that's something that will be really critical in the upcoming months when we hopefully get to really adopt the framework, is that everyone is on board together, especially the vulnerable ones.
So when I arrived today, I must admit, I thought you would be in the hotel, but Barbara had to literally drag you out of the IMO to come and speak to me this afternoon. And I'm so glad that we've had this conversation. What are you continuing to? How long are you going to be here for? And what are you continuing to do at the IMO this week?
So right now is we're on the 20th intersessional working group, meaning we're looking at the guidelines of, you know, the framework, even though it's not been adopted, but we're still trying to make sure that we do the work that we need to do, you know, so that it helps towards, you know, in a year's time when we're adopted, we have this work done. And so we're continuing here. I mean,
what sort of things are up for discussion? Can you give me
I think
don't need to tell me the details.
Yeah,
of
I don't
them,
have to say.
Just some things that you're talking about.
We're talking about, I think, the main thing that we're talking about, and the Pacific is really serious about, is the net zero fund. Making sure that when the net zero fund gets, you know, the revenues from the framework, making sure that these funds are distributed equitably to states like ours. You know, I think that's one of the main topics that we're discussing on that net zero fund, to make sure that our countries are part of that just and equitable transition.
So maybe if some of the developed countries that were against this realise the effect that it's having on small island nations like yours, that it will hopefully make them realise that the 50p on the iPhone isn't exactly going to be economic disaster, and the benefits will be absolutely there for everybody to see, but in particular there for you to see and you to experience on these island nations where the sea has such an impact on your lives.
Yes, it's literally our lifeline. And we already knew that the transition was going to be costly. But what we wanted to know is, how could we mitigate the costs of that transition for our states? That was the main thing. And we wanted to make sure that we were part of, you know, getting those revenues for us to transition as well. You know, because for sure, the developed countries can transition because they have the technologies, they have the capacities, but we need to make sure that our countries as well could transition along. That's why we say transition and not leaving anyone behind. And that was us, because we were going to be left behind because we couldn't afford the transition. You know? And I think, you know, Barbara literally came and pulled me out of while we were discussing the fund, the net zero fund discussions. But, you know, one thing that I love about moments like that is the story that we get to tell. And I think that, you know, getting the story, you know, from a Pacific perspective of what happened on Friday last week, but also to get that perspective of what we're continuing to do despite what happened to us. I think to get that story out there, and man, that's why when Barbara told me about the podcast, I said, man, in any way that we can get that story out there, we really need to get it out there. You know, the courage of our leaders, the resilience of our Pacific delegations, you know, of not giving up. I think that story needs to get out there. And I mean, platforms like your podcast and other interviews that I've been part of are really, really key. So, man, thank you so much. And I would do that. I would do that to make sure that our story gets out there.
So the podcast, as I said to you, it's in its infancy at the moment, but it does go to a lot of countries. And let's assume that there is somebody that's fairly key in one of these developed countries listening to this podcast.
Yeah.
What would you say to somebody in a developed country that was a bit skeptical about what was going on? What would you say to them if they were sat in front of you right now?
Yeah.
What would you say to them?
I would look them in the eye. I'd say, here, come and sit with me. And depends on where we are too. I would invite that person wherever we are beside the water and just let them know this is what's happened. You know, are you going to find the courage to fight for your countries or fight for your communities in moments where climate has been really, really impacting our countries? And I'll tell them, think with your heart. What does it mean, you know, to be in spaces like this, fighting for your communities? You know, we've come all the way from the Pacific. So I'll tell them, think with your heart, my friend. Think with your heart and think about your communities, you know, sea level rise. You know, community just continuously being impacted. And this 1 year is, again, more impacts on our country. So that's the thing I would say. Think and reflect with your heart.
Think and reflect with your heart.
Yeah, man.
Okay. Listen, John, thank you very, very much for talking to me this afternoon. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. A real pleasure and an honour, really, to get insight direct from a committee that I teach people about. We talk about these MEPCs coming out. We talk about MARPOL and what have you. So it's a real pleasure to speak to somebody that's been there at these meetings debating this. And
I appreciate the time and space.
I really appreciate you talking to me this afternoon. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. And you there listening, I can hear you. You know, you there. I can, you, that's you.
Yeah.
Listen, think, and reflect with your heart. Cheers. Love all you guys, man.
Thank you very much, John.